This is Brevard Watch, the news experience focused exclusively on Florida's Space Coast. I'm Matt Reed. My thanks to Brevard Public Schools for making possible today's in-depth interview and headlines from across the Space Coast. Today, we spot trends and make sense of this past week's primary election results in Brevard County. Joining me for that is Bill Mick, morning host of Bill Mick Live on WMMB Radio. Bill's known as a conservative, but has spent weeks now doing informative interviews with nearly every local candidate. We'll dig into things with Bill in just a second, but first, a disclaimer for those new to the show. Brevard Watch is a nonpartisan program that makes no political endorsements. We engage and educate by presenting a variety of perspectives, some of which are bound to be provocative. My observations and the opinions of my guests are our own. They are never the official position of the school board or Brevard Public Schools. Bill, thanks so much for joining us again in the BPS TV studio. It's always great to talk to you.
It's always fun.
All right, so we're going to spot some trends and some maybe patterns in the data. The one that I saw in the local results was that it was a pretty good night in Brevard for women and some minority candidates. Just to go down some of the results, women were the top vote getters in all three school board races. Misty Belford won in North Brevard. I think she goes to a runoff with a write-in candidate there.
Right.
Andy Ziegler, an incumbent in South Brevard, lost to Katie Campbell and Kelly Damerow, who now will go face each other in a November runoff. Mm-hmm. In District 3, Central Brevard, Cheryl McDougall, I guess she was the top vote getter in that race, and now she's going to go run against Charles Parker in District 3. Down the ticket or down the ballot in places, Circuit Judge Melissa Soto, already an appointed judge.
Retained her seat.
Retained her seat by a pretty wide margin. County Judge Katie Jacobus won that one pretty handily. District 2 County Commissioner, we've got an interesting race there between Victoria Michener, who is an African-American Democrat. She's a combat veteran, runs an HR department or consulting firm for veterans. She's been a leader in the Central Brevard NAACP, and she's going to be running against Brian Lober, Republican, self-funded attorney.
A surprise win there.
District 4 County Commission was the one where the woman didn't win, but that was a unique animal where Kurt Smith beat Trudy Infantini to stay on the county commission, at least won the Republican primary.
And the nastiest of the Brevard races. It was horrible.
And then down in the Palm Bay City Council race, there was an interesting one there where Kenny Johnson, a 26-year-old sports trainer, African-American, seemed to come out of nowhere to not only wipe out Trey Holton, a sitting city councilman, and I think he goes to a runoff with Thomas Gaume.
And he's nearly 20 points up the way it finished here. Where the question is, where do the Trey Holton votes go?
That's right.
And what kind of impact will that 21.5% have, provided all those people vote again?
You've interviewed all the candidates, correct?
Most
of the
some
candidates.
Didn't show up, but most.
Anybody who responded to an invitation, you gave them time on your program.
Absolutely.
And so when you interview, just for the unacquainted, when you interview candidates, are you taking sides and arguing with them during the interviews? Or are you pretty much just asking them straight up open-ended questions?
I rarely script questions. I'm familiar enough with the issues because of what I do every day. I can pretty much lay it out and be conversant on whatever topic is in play, no matter what the race is. This time, though, because of the contentiousness, because of the deception and lies that were out there, what I did was I didn't write questions, but I took issues from each race, and I highlighted those issues. I walked in with a sheet ready to go. I want to hit these issues with every candidate. Didn't get to every issue with every candidate because of the length of answers or whatever. If a candidate became outright deceptive or off topic and started attacking somebody, I would challenge them a little bit. But generally, I want to see what you think on this, and tomorrow when I've got your opponent on, I want to see what he thinks on this. Same question.
Same question for the same candidates or candidates in the same races. Mm-hmm. What do you think the argument or the issues are going to be in education this year, especially, in all the school board races?
I think first and foremost is school safety. I don't think the public is happy with the school resource officer and the security personnel that they are training now and getting ready to hire, or they've hired and getting ready to put on the job. One person per school is not enough if you have an active shooter. And I think the board as a whole, along with the former superintendent, backed out from underneath the sheriff, with the exception of maybe Matt Susan and Tina Deskovich, who were very strong on we need to arm personnel in the schools who are trained and willing to be armed. I'm not asking anybody who doesn't want to be armed. I think that's going to be a big issue, and I think depending on who gets elected here, you'll see that revisited, and you will see that put into play at some point in the next year.
So let me clarify that issue, just to make sure I know where you're coming from.
Sure.
The way the school board did go was, rather than take volunteers, they hired school security specialists, but ran them through the exact same training as the guardians. So they would be they wouldn't be a school resource officer that police departments provide. They'd fill that same role as a guardian. You could assign them to the schools where you need them. What you're saying is that's not enough.
Correct.
Not so much that you object to that happening.
No,
but
not at all.
You would rather
it's better than nothing.
You would rather have just more people on campuses who are armed because they happen to volunteer, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I just want to make sure I understood that, because it's going to be a big issue
It will
in school board races, and I think it's a good way to pause on those things.
When you get back into the races, after that issue is out there, it's always going to flow around the budget, how money is spent, the life of the half-cent sales tax, whether it's extended or not, whether they're for extending it, whether that money's being used properly. And the problem that I see in most cases is candidates come to a school board race with passion. They have an interest, a desire to do something positive for schools, but many are not familiar enough with the budgetary issues and what the restrictions are on the money and how it must be spent in certain cases to know how they can be effective in moving money around. And there's a learning curve in that school board job.
Sure there is.
And it's not a short one. It will take 6 months, 8 months, a year, maybe longer to be conversant on all of that. And you're making decisions all along the way that impact how these schools operate.
That's a good point, Bill. I mean, by way of disclosure to our audience, I manage a department at Brevard Public Schools, the Government and Community Relations Office. It's probably one of the smallest in terms of budget and departments, and it's hard. It's hard to just figure out our budgets. And last couple of years, we've tried to cut expenses to send more money back to schools and for teacher raises. But it's really, really hard. But at the same time, you try to respect the fact that school board members have an oversight role. And you need to listen to them, because they represent the people that you're serving as well. So,
well, and you've got to think about your people in that circumstance, because they're working hard for the success of schools. They deserve to make a living. They deserve a pay raise every now and then. But when you talk about those things, you're talking about increasing $1 billion budget. It's not easy to do.
I think something like it's like $4 million for each percentage point of a raise that you would give to somebody. So if you don't have 8, if you don't have 4, or you don't have 8, it's a difficult situation.
Very true.
Let's talk about that subject for just a second. I heard from a couple of political pollsters around Florida who have been involved in various tax referenda votes that when they assembled focus groups of largely Republican voters and fiscally conservative voters and gave them a chance to just sort of warm up and talk amongst themselves and see what kind of issues bubbled to the top. Teacher pay was one of the very first things that these people on the right or red voters brought up. I guess they had seen news from other states where teachers were going on strike or something. Does that surprise you?
I've got good friends who are teachers, and I see starting teacher pay in Brevard. I know what my son, who is a Brevard County Sheriff's Deputy, started at. It's less than what a teacher makes. I see those both as essential public service jobs. I think starting teacher pay is actually pretty good here, and I'll be beat up for that. But if you're making $40,000 a year walking into the classroom for the first time, how many jobs do you make $40,000 a year at walking into? Not too many around this country, unless you've got a more advanced degree. And I get it, teachers work hard to get that degree. I have a dear friend who's just done it over the last year or so. I watched her work very hard, and she was a teacher's assistant here in Brevard, a teacher's aide, and is now teaching for the first time in a 4th grade class. Now, she had 15 years of teaching pre-K in another county where the degree wasn't required, so she walks in with a boatload of experience, walking in and starting teacher pay. She's ecstatic and happy. She's attained that goal of getting that degree and doing what she loves to do. And you see her after a day of school and she's just smiling to beat the band because it was such a great day with those kids. That's the kind of teacher we want. If we want to keep them, you're going to have to pay them a little bit and give them a raise once they're there. Acknowledge what they're doing. It doesn't surprise me the issue came up, but let's be reasonable about it when we look at it. And a lot of times when you see raises in play, the unions come into the discussion and they want raises for the people on the top end of the scale, and they forget these folks on the lower end.
So it's really about taking care of people over time.
Exactly.
Making sure that we're taking care of our good people who are
People
serving
get into
us.
it for a career. And through the course of a career, you expect pay to be increased, not the other way around. You expect to have the ability to advance, to become maybe a lead teacher or part of a team that does something special. And everybody should be able to advance like the superintendent did through the ranks and to the top job. Why not?
Interesting. One of the sort of the political movements that I've seen in the past year started with the Guardian debate, was the Moms for Change group that came out, and they were so fired up, and they packed school board meetings and were there raising green cards for statements that they liked and red cards for those that they didn't like.
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to make a difference in this election?
Nope.
Do they sustain that, do you think?
Nope. Passion versus practicality. The voters, by and large, will take a look at these candidates and their positions on these issues. And it's great to have passion, but if your passion is based in ignorance or fear, which those who think having a gun around a school is a problem, not the case, or we'd have cops shooting kids all over schools all over the country. Well, those are policemen. No. How many policemen have been in an active shooter situation? Of the thousands and thousands of policemen in this country, very few. The guys in Jacksonville just last weekend who went into a situation where the gamer decided he was all upset because he lost in this Madden 19 gaming tournament, went back in, shot up the place, killed 2 others, killed himself, 10 others or 11 wounded. The policemen and firemen who responded there did not have experience in that before in most cases. So,
well, we will see how things go in the November election. It's always hard to sustain any kind of a political movement, even if they said that they were absolutely going to campaign against those people who supported a Guardian program. We'll just have to see where they show up. Definitely, they seem to be coming a lot from Viera and the South Beaches, where there are not school board races this year. So we'll see if that makes a difference. Let's switch topics here and talk about the Brevard County Commission.
Sure.
They oversee so much: roads, lagoon responses, spending on law and order, direction generally coming out of the primary election. You know, Kurt Smith kept his seat, but now we have a contested seat in Central Brevard by somebody that is running against the way things have been. What do you make of that?
Well, you had Chuck Lober, Brian Lober, beat Chuck Nelson, which was a surprise to me. Chuck Nelson's a very popular man on Merritt Island, and Lober invested his own money. What I read in Florida today, earlier this week, $109,000 of his own money to win this job, and he beat Chuck Nelson. He will face Victoria Michener, the Democrat, as you mentioned earlier. Lober had the endorsement of Scott Ellis. He had the support of the farther right side of the Republican Party. And those folks support with a passion, sometimes without any practicality. While he preached the mantra very well, on the interview on my show, he was nearly clueless on how this all worked. He's a personable man. I think he is a viable candidate down the road, but he's going to have to be viable now if the conservatives want to maintain the kind of control on the commission that they hope to have. And his first idea to me was, I want to reduce the county commission salaries by $10,000 so they're closer to the median salary of Brevard County residents, as if that $50,000 that you save annually in $10,000 from each of the commissioners is a drop in the bucket in $1 billion a year budget. It just didn't make sense. It was a great talking point. It resonated with the cheerleading crowd that's already on his side, but it didn't make sense to somebody who was critically analyzing the race. Chuck Nelson was so much more informed and knowledgeable about the function and the dollars and how they play in the county. It seems to me this was not necessarily a good vote for the folks in District 2. Again, I'm not anti-Lober. I want to see him win now. He's the only choice after he ran Chuck Nelson out as far as I'm concerned. But he's got a lot of learning to do. That's a strange situation.
You were no fan of Chuck Nelson when he was a city county
Absolutely
commissioner.
not. And it surprised me that I backed him as far as how I would have voted if I lived in that district. But he is such a more knowledgeable candidate than Lober was at the time they interviewed on my show. Lober's got time to bone up before November, but let's hope he doesn't cling to fringy elements, and that he starts recognizing there's a practical side to your policies in government.
I would like to see, this is my personal take, as somebody who just moved to Merritt Island and lived on Satellite Beach for 16 years.
Yes, you did.
This idea that you're going to do away with community redevelopment agencies, for example. Okay. Show me that you know what they do now and explain what you would stop doing and what kind of projects you think are worthwhile that you might continue. And Merritt Island, which does not have a city government, I think a lot of people who live in Merritt Island are always surprised to hear that. You have county government. You have this sort of weird mix of fire department and sheriffs that are paid by your Metropolitan Service Taxing District. I always get that wrong.
MSTU, yeah.
And then you have this redevelopment agency that's been doing kind of beautification projects and plumbing and drainage and stuff. Okay, well, if we're going to do away with that on Merritt Island, what happens? And how do you manage the change if you're a county commissioner? I'd like to hear an affirmative outlook on some things coming from that side rather than just what they're against.
Well, if you'd watched Kurt Smith, and I know you have, so the answer is out there. Kurt Smith, although John Tobias tried to take credit for the work, Kurt was working on this before Tobias was ever on the commission. One or two of the Melbourne CRAs are going to disappear. The county's participating with them in getting Babcock Street up to snuff through the city of Melbourne and going to deed that street over to them. They're using some CRA money to help make that happen. The new hotel project in downtown Melbourne, there's a CRA involvement there, but that CRA is eventually going to disappear as well. But that's helping with an alley behind the new hotel behind Meg O'Malley's. So that's going to bring, the CRA is going to bring that alley up to snuff for use there. There are ways to do this, and Kurt was working on those as John Tobias came in, and he had the votes to make it happen then. But other folks like to take credit for some other people's work at times.
Now, I just want to come back to an item in one of your most recent columns that almost made me fall out of my chair.
Okay.
And it was, I guess you and Representative Randy Fine have been going back and forth with some disagreements over.
Well, he was on the other side of that commission race.
And he's been funding, mailers and other things to try to unseat Kurt Smith and support Trudy Infantini. He was going into surgery and sent you a text message.
He did.
What happened?
He did. He was going into surgery one Friday a couple of weeks ago, and his message to me was, in case I don't come out of general anesthesia going into this procedure, I want to leave you with a final thought. And it was the anti-Kurt mailer that looked like the creature from the Black Lagoon, basically lying that Kurt Smith polluted the lagoon. Didn't happen, not what happened, but how much vitriol is there in your heart if that's your last thought to me before you go under the knife? It became very personal. It became very contentious. There was a lot of deception and lies in that side from the Trudy cabal, and it was nasty. It's the nastiest thing. To be honest, it caused me to lose faith in Randy Fine. I thought he had more integrity than that. I thought he had the ability to learn his job.
He'd been a regular on your show, correct?
Very much so. Throughout the legislative session, each of the 2 terms he's been in, he was calling in just about every week. And it was informative and good to have him there. I can't trust him now. He showed that when he has political dislike for someone, he's willing to attack their character, the character of a good man, that, hey, I've got some political disagreements with my friend Kurt Smith. I didn't like fire fees being raised. I didn't like the ambulance tax being raised. It's a fee. And it was a tax increase, whether you called it that or not. And I called Kurt out on it when it happened. But I know his heart. I know he's a quality individual. And yeah, we disagreed politically. Doesn't mean you try to tear a man down and personally do that and do it with lies and deception. And I'm so disappointed in Randy Fine. It's not funny. It is funny.
We look at these kinds of things. I mean, you wrote about that in Florida today, and
Sure.
read about it.
Sure.
Do relationships heal after things like this? You see people.
This one's going to be hard. I got to be honest.
You see people who were friends politically, and then they run against each other in a primary, and it just gets so heated and personal and paranoid that.
Well, you had interference in this. Number one, if I'm a sitting state representative, I consider myself a little bit above a county commission race. My only involvement would be to endorse or not to endorse. Randy Fine went well beyond that. John Tobias, through his relationship with Jason Brodeur over in Seminole County, it would appear that he influenced Brodeur to get into this race. Mike Herodopoulos, the grandfather of leadership funds in Florida now, it was his top priority his last year in the Senate, was to recreate those funds that allowed this type of money shuffling to happen where a race is perverted like this. It's a big problem. And as all of that comes into play, you can lose track of the money pretty easily. They try to hide who's doing this, who's doing that. But Randy Fine, at least he owned what he did. It was despicable what he did. And the relationship between Fine and the county commission, other than John Tobias, has not been good. Randy Fine has the mindset that officials in Tallahassee oversee officials in Brevard or officials in a city like Melbourne, Palm Bay, Satellite Beach, that they answer to these state officials. Not the case. We elect different governments for different reasons, but he believes they answer to him and should do his bidding. And he got after Kurt. When Kurt properly made decisions with TDC money to do TDC things with them, we're already spending a better than $40 million a year tax on the lagoon, and they spent $5 million to turf the fields out here in Vieira that are going to allow kids to come here from all over the country, play all year long. You get in the rainy season trying to play a baseball tournament, you're doing it on natural turf, you're not going to get very much done. On an artificial turf field, they're going to be able to play for quite a while and recover from a rain situation a lot quicker than you would on a natural surface. So it was an appropriate expenditure. He had a political disagreement. He turned it personal. He tried to make it all about the lagoon. And a lot of these officials in Brevard are trying to make everything about the lagoon. Well, I'm sorry, we're now throwing $40 million a year in that tax into the lagoon. Are we seeing any results from it? Do we really have a good plan? And would that other $5 million make a big difference to that? I don't think so. So they convolute the issues. They try to spin it the way they want it spun. This was the ugliest political season I've seen in Brevard. I'm not happy about it. And I don't think relationships heal, not very quickly anyway, after something like this.
Maybe the best advice is don't get your main information about candidates from postcards.
Mailers, radio ads, TV ads, they're all essential. And for candidates, if you can't tell me what you're doing positively, if you can't show me your positive record and tell me what you plan to do, if all you can do is take shots at the person you're running against, you're not running for a job, you're running against somebody, and I don't think I want you there. I don't know that you're qualified if you can't talk about what you can do.
So let me revise my earlier statement. A postcard where you're touting your accomplishments and your positions is something that is okay, but it's those
still verify it.
It's those hit pieces that tend to be, you know they have to be, there's something more to that story.
And they went
both
ways in that
race.
race.
Time. You know, when you see that person in black and white and it's looks
right.
all ominous.
Oh, the funny one was, and this came from Kurt's side, although Kurt said he didn't know they did it. Allegedly, the Business Voice folks had contracted with somebody out of Tallahassee to produce some hit pieces on Trudy. They did one where her hair was really bright white, and she's got great blonde hair. Her face was red, looked like she was Storm from the X-Men.
Oh my goodness.
And talking about temper tantrum Trudy. She had stormed out of a couple of county commission meetings when Robin Fisher got her goat on the dais, and she didn't fulfill her job those days. That was a legitimate point to talk about. They did it with the mailer. They didn't start the ugly mailers. Randy Fine did with the creature from the Black Lagoon. So there you go.
All right, final topic here, Bill, just for fun. One of the things we've seen in the last election cycle or two are really high-profile endorsements by Sheriff Ivey for the past couple of election cycles. And this year, in the Republican primaries, you saw and heard endorsements from Scott Ellis, another prominent local figure. And very often, they were endorsing competing candidates. Scoreboard?
Wayne Ivey's endorsement is sought because he's a popular sheriff. He does a good job as sheriff, and he's also a good politician, and he has mastered both of those career fields. Wayne is personable. People like Wayne. An endorsement from Wayne means something, and they want those endorsements. I think Wayne has diluted his endorsement somewhat, and that he's endorsed so many places. Renee Placencia, Kurt Smith, I'm not sure who else along the way. Scott Ellis got into this game. Now, Scott has always advised candidates, especially those more fiscally conservative candidates that will live in the camp where Scott is by and large. And I live there by and large. But Scott has a propensity at times to get behind candidates who are wacko fringe. We'll go to former school board candidate Dean Padarakis and the races he's been in. Scott's been behind him before, not doing ads, but saying, I'd like to see him win this. Now Scott jumped into the ad thing as Wayne did. We were joking around the radio station that Wayne Ivey was on our radio station more than our weather and traffic people were because he was on so many ads. Of course, he doesn't control how many ads the candidate buy, but he was there a lot. Kurt was on ads for Brian Lober, for Trudy Infantini, and for Jeff Bailey down in Palm Bay. People he sees as fiscally conservative folks. And they have an impact with the audience that is strong in that regard. And
from a messaging standpoint, I thought for a Republican, I mean, I'm not commenting on the content of the message so much,
Sure.
But from a Republican messaging standpoint, I thought they were both effective.
Mm-hmm.
Here you have Wayne Ivey saying, speaking from his point of view as somebody who supports law. This is a person who supports law and order, supports my agreement with immigration and custom enforcement to deal with illegal immigrants who are arrested.
Right.
And like you said, just lending that kind of persona. And then for Scott Ellis, you had his message that this candidate is beholden to no special interest and answers to nobody. He's an independent person who
Financed
takes no
himself.
dollars.
Yeah.
Right. So, for people who like that message, hearing Scott Ellis's actual voice saying that is something a little more genuine than just the
candidate
type of
claiming
thing
it
that
with
you
no
might-
history behind it,
Correct,
or without the ability to have the voice that Scott
I
did.
thought it was interesting.
Absolutely, and I think it could be effective there. My problem when a candidate asserts, I'm not taking money from political action committees or from special interests or from this lobbyist or that lobbyist because I don't want to owe them anything. Well, does that tell me you think your vote can be bought? What that money donated to your campaign buys them is an ear, not a vote. And if these people believe in you and want to donate to your campaign, be smart enough to know it takes now $100,000 to be elected to a county commission seat in Brevard County. That number used to be around 40 or a little less.
Wow, that's a lot.
100 grand in both of these races. Both of these winning candidates spent 100 grand plus to keep in Kurt and in Brian Lober's races to win those races. $100,000. Be ready to raise it or be ready to give it up out of your pocket if you want to be a county commissioner. That's nuts for a $58,000 a year job.
And it's only going to get more expensive between now and when early and mail voting begins in what, October? Not too far off.
Yeah, for the general, yeah. I've got a week of vacation and then interviews to schedule and mail ballots and then early voting will be a couple of weeks before November 6th. So
How do you get it all done?
you don't. You squeeze in what you can and you try to prioritize what's important.
Bill Mick, thanks for joining us in the BPS TV studio.
Thank you, Matt Reed. Always fun.
Well, that's Brevard Watch for this week. My thanks to WMMB Radio for sharing its #1 rated morning host, Bill Mick, with us today. Listen for him from 6 to 9 a.m. weekdays on AM 1240 or 1350 in North Brevard. My thanks again to Brevard Public Schools for making this third season of Brevard Watch possible. I'm Matt Reed. Our producer and photographer is Mike Francisco. I'll leave you with this tip. You can get highlights of Brevard Watch right on your phone's newsfeed by liking the Brevard Public Schools Facebook page.